1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944, 1945. 1944. 6 years, 50 million lives, one continent in flames. 1940.
The common belief of the mid-20th century is that the United States and the Soviet Union were unbreakable brothers in arms until the Iron Curtain fell in 1945. But the history paradox reveals a darker, suppressed reality. America was fighting the Soviets while the world was still on fire. We are conditioned to view the good war as a singular struggle against Berlin, yet the Archangelus glitch of a new era was manifesting in the skies and snowdrifts of Europe, where American pilots were being shot out of the air by their own supposed allies. This was the systemic liquidation of a global myth, a high-velocity betrayal where the visual moat of propaganda hid a hot war of clandestine dogfights and cold-blooded abandonments. If you are ready to peel back the high-status marketing of the Grand Alliance and witness the systemic glitches that births 70 years of nuclear terror, you must decide if you are a passenger of the common narrative or a practitioner of the truth. By subscribing to this archive and engaging with this forensic investigation, you ensure that these erased chapters of human tragedy are finally accounted for. At the height of the struggle against the swastika, the Iron Spear of the West and the Steamroller of the East were already engaged in a secret civil war for the soul of the future, a $20 billion logistical nightmare where the only end state was a world divided by blood and concrete. The common belief surrounding the liberation of Yugoslavia in late 1944 is one of a seamless Allied coordination, a unified front where the American Iron Spear and the Soviet Steamroller crushed the retreating remnants of the German Wehrmacht in a display of total military synergy. But the history paradox reveals a violent, incandescent rupture in this narrative, a navigational software conflict that turned a routine strafing mission into the first kinetic collision of the Cold War. On November 7, 1944, near the city of Niš, the visual moat of the Grand Alliance was shattered when 3 groups of American P-38 Lightnings descended from the gray Balkan clouds to liquidate what they believed were German transport columns, only to find themselves decapitating the Soviet 6th Guards Rifle Corps. This was the Niš Gap, a systemic glitch where the reality of industrial violence moved faster than the information network meant to control it. The air over the road from Niš to Alexinac was thick with the scent of wet autumn earth and the acrid smoke of a retreating army. The American pilots, elite practitioners of high-velocity ground support, were operating on a reality map that placed the Soviet front lines miles to the east. As they sighted a massive column of trucks and horse-drawn wagons, their internal software identified only one possibility: the enemy. The P-38s tilted their wings, the twinned-engine silhouettes appearing like predatory ghosts against the slate-gray sky, and unleashed a firestorm of .50 caliber rounds and 20mm cannon fire. Below, the Soviet soldiers, men who had fought from the ruins of Stalingrad to the borders of the Reich, were suddenly being mown down by the very aircraft they had been told were their protectors. This was the biological liquidation of an ally, a tragedy of frequency where the American Iron Spear struck the heart of the Soviet software by mistake. The immediate aftermath was a pattern interruption that threatened to escalate into a full-scale theater war. As the Soviet commanders on the ground desperately fired red flares, the universal signal of friendly status, the American pilots, blinded by the marketing of their own mission, interpreted the flares as desperate German signals. They circled back for a second pass, their high-status hardware functioning perfectly as it shredded the 6th Guards command staff, including Lieutenant General G.P. Kotov. It was only when Soviet Yakolev fighters scrambled from a nearby airfield that the incident shifted from a tragic accident to a high-velocity dogfight. Allied steel met Allied steel in the sky over Niš, a systemic shock that forced every practitioner involved to confront the terrifying reality that the alliance was a fragile facade held together by nothing more than a shared enemy. This was the logistics of ego in its most visceral form. In the cockpits of the Yaks and the Lightnings, the pilots weren't thinking about the diplomacy of Yalta. They were caught in a primal architecture of survival. To the Soviet pilots, the Americans were software glitches that needed to be deleted from their airspace. To the Americans, the Yaks were unidentified threats in a zone where no friendly aircraft were supposed to be. The sky was illuminated by the ember glow of burning engines and tracer rounds as 3 American planes and 3 Soviet planes were spun into the dirt of Yugoslavia. When the smoke finally cleared, the ground truth was a forensic nightmare. 31 Soviet soldiers lay dead, and the reality anchor of the Grand Alliance had been permanently loosened. The dogfight over Niš was not merely a tactical error, but a terminal software crash of the Allied identification system. As the American P-38s pulled out of their second strafing run, they were intercepted by a flight of Soviet Yakolev fighters that had scrambled in a primal fury. The expectation for the American pilots was the appearance of the Luftwaffe, a high-status enemy they were trained to delete from the sky. The reality was the sleek, low-profile silhouette of the Yak, an aircraft that many U.S. pilots had never seen in a kinetic environment. In the claustrophobic confines of the cockpits, the biological latency of the pilots led to a lethal miscalculation. They saw the red stars on the Soviet wings, and in the heat of the pattern interruption, interpreted them as unusual German markings. The Iron Spear did not hesitate, and the air was filled with the rhythmic thrum of heavy machine guns as the Allies began to liquidate one another in a 15-minute storm of steel and fire. Below the aerial chaos, the ground was a scene of systemic liquidation. Soviet infantrymen who had survived the most brutal theaters of the Eastern Front stood in frozen horror as their own fighters engaged the Americans. The visual moat of the alliance had completely evaporated, replaced by the smell of vaporized fuel and the sight of burning aluminum plummeting into the Serbian mud. This was the Niš Gap at its most forensic level, a moment where the logistics of ego between the Western and Eastern commands resulted in the literal destruction of the men they were meant to lead. The American flight leader, Colonel C.T. Edwinson, found himself in a high-velocity duel with a Soviet ace, a practitioner of aerial combat who was not interested in diplomatic apologies. Every tracer round that streaked through the slate-gray sky, glowing with an incandescent ember glow, was a signal that the post-war world was already arriving, and it was arriving with a vengeance. The dogfight finally reached its end state when a frantic American pilot recognized the Soviet airbase at Niš and realized they were strafing their own brothers-in-arms. He broke radio silence, screaming for his flight to disengage, but the information hack had already taken its toll. 6 aircraft had been spun into the earth, 3 American, 3 Soviet, and the field was littered with the bodies of elite guardsmen who had been mown down by American .50 caliber rounds. This was the biological dead end of the Grand Alliance. As the P-38s banked and retreated towards their bases in Italy, the silence that settled over the road to Alexinac was not of peace, but of a profound systemic dread. The marketing campaign of a unified victory had been shattered by the ground truth of 31 Soviets, including a high-status general whose liquidation would demand a forensic accounting at the highest levels of power. In the hours following the Niš Gap, the command latency of the Allied high commands went into overdrive. General Eisenhower and Marshal Stalin were presented with a software conflict that threatened the very foundation of the war effort. If the truth of the Niš incident reached the public, the visual moat of the alliance would collapse, potentially giving the retreating Germans the pattern interruption they needed to negotiate a separate peace. The forensic solution was a systemic deletion. Both sides agreed to treat the event as a non-entity, a glitch in the record that was never to be discussed. This was the birth of the Cold War's information hack, the moment when the truth was liquidated to preserve the appearance of a unified operating system. But for the men who stood in the blood-stained mud mud of Yugoslavia that day, the reality anchor had been permanently shifted. They knew that the Iron Spear had already turned, and the next war had begun before the first one was even over. The systemic friction over the skies of Warsaw became a lethal information hack that paralyzed the American air crews stationed in Italy and Great Britain. The American pilots, practitioners of the Iron Spear doctrine, were eager to deliver the hardware of survival to the Polish Home Army, but they were trapped in a command latency trap set by the Kremlin. Every request for a shuttle mission where B-17s would drop supplies and then land in Soviet-held territory to refuel was met with a calculated silence from Moscow. This was the visual moat in action. By the time Stalin begrudgingly allowed a single massive drop on September 18, 1944, the biological liquidation of the resistance was nearly complete. Of the 1,200 containers dropped by the American hardware, only a fraction reached the Polish hands. The rest fell into the expanding hardware graveyard of German-held rubble, literally feeding the enemy that the Allies were supposedly trying to destroy. Inside the city, the ground truth was a forensic nightmare of biological shutdown. The Polish insurgents, mostly teenagers and young adults operating on high-agency improvisation, were being hunted through the sewers, the only systemic arteries left in a city that had been deleted from the surface of the earth. They carried British Sten guns and captured German Mausers, waiting for a signal from the east that would never come. This was the history paradox at
However, the Operation Unthinkable paradox hit a terminal hardware failure when the American practitioners, led by Harry Truman and General Eisenhower, refused to participate in the systemic rupture. They were operating on a different reality anchor. The American software was focused on the Pacific and the logistics of reconstruction, not a new apocalyptic struggle against an ally that had just sacrificed 20 million lives to defeat Hitler. The American commanders realized that any attempt to launch an Iron Spear into the Soviet heartland would result in a total liquidation of their own forces. The command latency between London and Washington proved to be the visual moat that saved the world from a nuclear winter before the first atomic bomb had even been dropped on Japan. The end state of Churchill's desperate gamble was a systemic deletion. The plans for Operation Unthinkable were filed away in the deepest vaults of the British operating system, hidden under a visual moat of secrecy that wouldn't be breached for decades. But the signal it sent was unmistakable. The alliance was dead, and the information hack of the Cold War was now the primary software of the planet. The history paradox audits this moment as the true birth of the nuclear stalemate, the point where the physics of power dictated that no Iron Spear could ever truly defeat the Steamroller without destroying the world itself. As the file was closed, the reality anchor of a divided Europe was permanently set, and the biological liquidation of the Great War gave way to the frozen friction of the new era. The software conflict within the British High Command reached a fever pitch as the physics of power collided with the ground truth of a war-weary world. Churchill's strategists, acting as the ultimate practitioners of geopolitical pattern interruption, presented their forensic audit of Operation Unthinkable in late May 1945. The expectation was that a high-velocity strike on July 1st would catch the Soviet Leviathan off balance, pushing the Steamroller back before its operating system could fully stabilize in the newly occupied territories. But the reality was a systemic friction that no amount of British resolve could overcome. The British Chiefs of Staff warned Churchill that the Soviet hardware was not just superior in numbers, it was seasoned by the biology of survival in a way the Western armies, already looking toward the marketing campaign of demobilization, simply were not. This was the logistics of ego meeting its biological dead end. To launch an Iron Spear against Stalin would have required the total systemic liquidation of the democratic promise. Churchill was told that for the mission to succeed, the Allies would need to commit to a total war even more devastating than the one they had just concluded. The information hack was clear. If the strike didn't result in an immediate software crash of the Soviet command, the Red Army would likely sweep across the visual moat of the Rhine and occupy the entire European continent within weeks. This wasn't a tactical risk, it was a global glitch in the making. The American operating system, meanwhile, was focused on the hardware of the Pacific, viewing any European escalation as a systemic rupture that would jeopardize the end state of the war against Japan. The legacy of the ruin from this period is the ultimate history paradox. We are taught that the victory in 1945 was a clean systemic reset, but the ground truth reveals it was a fragmented operating system that never truly unified. The visual moat of the Iron Curtain was not just a political boundary, it was a hardware partition of the human soul. As Churchill's unthinkable plans were moved to the isolated concrete islands of the secret archives, the biological liquidation of the alliance was finalized. The American Iron Spear and the Soviet Steamroller stood nose to nose across a line of white tape and barbed wire, two high-status powers locked in a frozen friction that would consume the wealth and lives of the next 3 generations. The end state of our forensic audit reveals the most haunting information hack of all. The good war didn't end with a signal of peace, but with a software update to the nature of conflict itself. We transitioned from the physics of metal to the physics of information. The systemic glitches of Niš, Warsaw, and Berchtesgaden were not anomalies. They were the visual proof of a new global operating system based on mutual distrust and the threat of total liquidation. The history paradox proves that while we were told the world was being saved for democracy, the practitioners of power were actually preparing the hardware for a stalemate that would keep the human race in a state of permanent night for half a century. The legacy of the ruin left by the collapse of the Grand Alliance was not a quiet transition to peace, but a high-status systemic partition of the human experience. The common belief is that the post-war reconstruction, spearheaded by the Marshall Plan, was a selfless act of biological restoration aimed at healing a broken continent. But the history paradox reveals a darker information hack. The reconstruction was actually the construction of a visual moat, a multi-billion-dollar hardware upgrade designed to turn Western Europe into a high-functioning buffer against the Soviet operating system. The Iron Spear had realized that it could not liquidate the steamroller through kinetic force, so it pivoted to a logistics of influence, using economic prosperity as a software patch to prevent the biological threat of communist ideology from spreading. As the physics of momentum shifted from tank columns to bank accounts, the Soviet Leviathan responded with its own architecture of control. Stalin understood that the visual moat of the West was a direct threat to his reality anchor in the East. He initiated a systemic liquidation of all non-communist human software in the nations he had liberated. From the Baltic to the Balkans, high-status practitioners of democracy, journalists, politicians, and intellectuals were treated as systemic glitches and deleted in a series of purges that history often obscures behind the marketing campaign of socialist progress. This was the Iron Curtain manifesting not just as a line on a map, but as a biological dead end for millions of people trapped behind a software conflict they never voted for. The information hack reached its terminal velocity in the divided city of Berlin. Here, the visual moat was not a metaphor, it was a physical hardware fracture in the center of the world. The expectation was that the joint occupation would be a temporary logistical solution until a unified German operating system could be restored. The reality was a command paradox that turned the city into a sensory deprivation chamber for the Cold War. In 1948, the Soviet Steamroller attempted a systemic blockage of the city, the Berlin blockade, forcing the American Iron Spear to innovate or retreat. The ground truth of the Berlin airlift was the ultimate marketing campaign for Western hardware. For nearly a year, a plane landed in Berlin every few minutes, delivering the biological necessities of coal and food. This was the physics of defiance. The American practitioners were not just delivering calories, they were uploading a signal of total commitment to their visual moat. They were proving that the Iron Spear could jump over the steamroller's blockades without firing a single shot. This software conflict proved that the new war would be won by the side that could maintain its reality anchor through superior logistics of ego and technological hardware. However, the history paradox audits a hidden cost to this end state. While the airlift was a triumph of the Iron Spear, it also finalized the systemic rupture. The expectation of a unified Germany was officially liquidated. In its place, two isolated concrete islands were formed, West Germany and East Germany, two separate operating systems that would remain in a state of permanent night for 40 decades. The biological of the Cold War was now set. The world was no longer a collection of nations, but a binary system where every human life was a data point in a struggle between two competing leviathans. The visual moat had become a permanent hardware installation in the global landscape. As we move into the final audit of the 1940s legacy, we must look at the information hack that permeated the domestic lives of the practitioners themselves. In both the West and the East, a systemic fear was installed into the human operating system. The marketing campaign of the Good War had been replaced by the marketing campaign of the Red Scare and anti-imperialism. This was the biological liquidation of trust. Families were divided, systemic glitches, suspected spies were hunted, and the reality anchor of truth was buried under layers of information friction. The Iron Spear and the Soviet Steamroller had successfully created a world where the only end state was survival and the only software was suspicion. The transition into the 1950s marked the terminal biological shutdown of the old world order as the physics of metal was replaced by the physics of the atom. The common belief is that the development of the hydrogen bomb was a necessary systemic upgrade to ensure national security and global peace through deterrence. But the history paradox audits a much darker information hack. The move to thermonuclear hardware was a systemic rupture that deleted the very concept of victory. The Iron Spear of the West and the Steamroller of the East had reached a biological dead end where the only end state was mutual, total liquidation. This was the birth of MAD, a software update to the global operating system that turned every city on the planet